Hello, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Noel, and today we have Mark Dalgleish, developer on the React Router team, here to talk about React Router and React Server components. Welcome to the show, Mark. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Of course, yeah, I'm excited to chat today. There's a lot going on here in React Router and Remix and all these recent changes and stuff. So I feel like before we jump in, can we kind of place where React Server components fit into the current React Router ecosystem, or the blueprint, for lack of a better term?
Yes, React Router has been, if you merge the history of Remix into React Router, has largely been solving, in many ways, a lot of the same problems that RSC is trying to solve, which is things like, how do you know what code to load when as you navigate around a website? How do you know how to load data on the server and pass that down to the client? How do you deal with things like form submissions and so on? And what's been tricky for Remix and now React Router is figuring out, how do we merge these two worlds together? How do we take what the React team has been doing and what we've been doing and merge it into a cohesive whole? So up to this point, we've been experimenting behind the scenes with what React Server Components looks like in a React Router world. And we've just recently shipped our new preview of RSC data mode, which you can play with right now. So you can start experimenting with what RSC looks like in React Router today. And we're also working on shipping that to framework mode consumers as well, which is our first-class support for the framework-level features through Vite.
Nice. Yeah. Can we contextualize that just a little bit more for people that maybe aren't in the world? But what are just conceptually, what is data mode versus framework mode with React Router?
Yeah, so in React Router, we actually have three different modes that you can choose from. The simplest one is declarative mode, where it's really just components that decide what to render based on the URL. Data mode is really bringing that more framework level functionality to React Router, where you define your routes statically up front, and all of your routes can have things like loaders and actions for controlling how to load data, how to manage form submissions, things that take it from being just a router that decides what to put on the screen to much more of that full framework experience. What stops it short from being something like a framework mode that we have is that it's not really integrated into a bundle or anything like that for you. If you want to do things like server rendering and do data loading on the server and pass the results down to the client, that kind of thing, it starts to require a bit more complicated interaction with the bundler. And you can do that sort of thing yourself on top of data mode, but it gets quite tricky. So yeah, if you want to just get the nice off-the-shelf solution using Vite, then framework mode is the solution for you there.
Is framework mode, do you guys view it as just kind of a more heavily opinionated data mode, like wrapping data mode, or is that an inaccurate?
The way I think about it for the average app, the way I think about it is that framework mode doing the things that you can't do as a library, ultimately. If you pull in a library from NPM and use it in your app code, Vite app that you've spun together, you're going to hit these problems straight away where it's like, I need to build for the server and the client, and I need to communicate between these environments. And you can do it, of course, manually yourself, but it's not easy. And framework mode just means that, okay, now you've got a Vite plugin you can stick in there, and it knows how to manage these environments for you and how to communicate between them.
You mentioned that with RSC, the preview is currently targeting data mode. Can you still use them if one is in framework mode, but just for specific use cases, or how do RSCs kind of play into this?
So as of right now, you can't use RSCs in framework mode, and that's something obviously people are asking for now that we've shipped some semblance of support for RSCs. I've been actively working full-time on getting RSC support into framework mode. And so that's the goal, is that if you still want that off-the-shelf solution that most people, I think, would go for, given the choice of these different modes, RSC framework mode when that comes out, that's going to be the way to go. But if you want to get on that bleeding edge, then RSC data mode is available now. And what's really nice is that data mode without RSCs is a lot less powerful than what you get with RSC data mode, because now with the way React is leaning into itself working with the bundler, you have to have an integration for RSC for your given bundler. It means that it's sort of native to React, having some knowledge of how the server and client parts of your application are linked to each other in the bundler and how they communicate. And so if you look at an RSC data mode app, it actually looks very close to what a framework mode app looks like. They're very similar. So that's what's been really nice for me, is that it means that framework mode is becoming less of a custom thing for us and more about leaning into the native RSC support from React and the support that Vite itself is getting as well.
Elizabeth here, production assistant for PodRocket. We're running a listener survey to help shape future episodes and make the podcast a better experience. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes of your time, and you can find the link in the description.
It feels like at some point, if you're in like RSC with data mode, you're using it like a framework. I'm air quoting framework a little bit already anyway. Like, how is this going to differ when you guys get this migrated and set up for React Router framework mode? Where is that delineation going to be in like what the framework is handling versus what I'm thinking about as a developer when I'm using RSCs?
Yeah, so if you're using RSC data mode today, it can work, but you're still missing a lot of the niceties that you get from something that's a bit more polished and presented as a framework. For one thing, like configuring routes has a bit more boilerplate and doesn't support file system routing. That's something that you'll get in framework mode. HMR is something that we make sure works, especially in the case where we have our own APIs on top of what's out in the stock standard RSC Vite setup that you might have. A good example of an API that we've added on top is the route module API, where you can co-locate everything in the one file, even if it's on server and client. Even in an RSC world, we're still maintaining that API. So for me, like maybe most importantly, the number one thing is that we're giving people the ability to migrate existing React Router applications over to this world as well. Because all of these route module APIs, the loaders and actions and everything that we've presented before will still work as it did before, but with the additions of what RSC brings to the table as well.
In data mode in particular, what are RSCs really enabling now that they weren't before? What is the performance benefit here? Why do devs and consumers eventually care about this, users?
Yeah, I think for me, the big thing that makes me interested in server components is that it really provides a way to do, there's a couple of things that I personally find interesting. One is it's a good way to get code out of the browser bundles that doesn't need to be there. The best examples for developers of where this pays off is something like a Markdown React component, where you've got some code that's going to parse Markdown and figure out, I'm going to render an H1 and a P tag and a link and so on. And you've got all this heavy code that you need in order to calculate just a few React elements is ultimately the result of it. In your traditional SSR React app, you have to send all of that Markdown parsing logic. You have to run it on the server first, of course, to do server-side rendering, but you also have to hydrate that entire app on the client, and all of that code has to go with it. With server components, something like that can be solved very differently, where I'm just going to run my Markdown parser only ever on the server, and then I'm just going to send down the React elements that it calculated as the result down to the browser. So that's really interesting, I think, especially as someone who's worked in a lot of developer tools, and our developer tooling websites are often full of things like Markdown components and code snippets like highlighting and things
JSON
like that.
Parsers and all this stuff.
Yeah, and let's just get that all out of the browser. We don't have to have these really heavy websites anymore. And the other use case that's really interesting to me is when you've got UI that is not so strictly coupled to the URL. So a really good example of this is something like the newsfeed in Facebook, funnily enough, which probably explains why so much of this is coming out of Facebook or people who used to work on it, where your newsfeed and my newsfeed might be really different depending on the sorts of content we're being presented. And that means that what the server can do is work out dynamically for each user, what UI do we need to send them? And then we'll only send them down the things we actually rendered. Whereas if you go for your more traditional route-based splitting, like you've had in React Router, it's very easy to naively just bundle every potential component you might render on a page and have to send that down.
Which I think has been the de facto for so long. It's hard to kind of get out of that mindset. I guess you mentioned there just traditional server-side rendering and rehydration. Can we go over that again? Why historically was that? Why did we have to send our whole like Markdown parser to the client, and why is that such a bad thing?
The way that React worked when you would do server-side rendering is the way I used to think about it when I was new to it. It was almost like if you think of rendering in the browser as just like a series of frames in like a game engine or something. It's like the very first frame was rendered on the server. All of the code that created that frame now also needs to be sent down to the browser to recreate it again. So it can start from frame one and then onwards. Everything from then on is running in the browser. But there's no way to say this part of the React tree only runs on the server and this only runs on the client. It was all the same application. And so yeah, what that meant is that if you wanted to do server rendering of anything, you still had to send all of the logic for that down to the browser.
That may be the cleanest explanation of SSR, React SSR that I've ever heard. So I appreciate that. How did your approach to thinking about this, like RSCs, where to put them and how to get developers to adopt them and get this into just like the developer headspace? How have you factored that into your guys' implementation and approach and like just wiring this up? Are there any decisions you guys have had to make there, or has it kind of just been like a process of going through and checking the boxes for support here?
I think for me, the main thing up front is making sure that the overall architecture is still the same. Like you've still got that same flow of when a request comes in, we match it to routes, get all the data for those routes, and then we go to the rendering stage, even with server components. And we've made it so that you can incrementally adopt RSC features if and when you see fit. So even what I find really interesting about that is it means that as a consumer, you can really start to play around with it if you want to, but you can also be completely in this theoretical future where potentially we go all in on this as the default. You might not even be aware that you're using RSC at all because the developer experience, the code that you're writing, even the build output feels very similar to what you had before you were using RSC.
I'm curious about if you guys are thinking much about the devs who are like, maybe they're like more full stack, they're not in this headspace much. Is there a way you recommend that they think about this? Like, how proactive are they? Would you recommend they be in thinking what they can have and trying to consider what they can put into a React server component? Is there like a good recommendation for how to look for candidate parts of your app that would be easy to move up and get some of this work out of the browser?
For a lot of people, they don't actually see a clear benefit for moving to server components. So I think if you're saying to them, take your standard framework mode app and then start thinking about what parts you want to move over to the server, it might not be clear to them when they should be doing that. I think for someone like that who wants to think less about the architecture, it might make more sense to go more all in on server components and make client components the exception. In our RSC framework mode that we're working on at the moment, we have added an additional export to the route module API. So right now you can export your component as your default component. That's implicitly a client component. Even though it's server rendered, it's in an RSC sense, it's a client component. But now you can also optionally export a server component export instead. And that's your way of opting in a route to just be a server first route. All the other APIs basically stay the same, but it means now if you want to have client components, they need to be separate modules with use client directive. You import those. So I think I've been so heads down on working on it. I haven't actually thought as much about how would I exactly recommend different types of people adopt this. But I do think it makes sense that interested in RSC to play around with just going all in as the default.
How does that delineation actually work? So say I guess our server, like our routes, kind of the highest level entity where one can flip this switch. Is that like the top from the data mode perspective in React Router?
What's really nice about this architecture is that you don't have to decide at an app level, am I going to use RSC or not? It's more that the RSC mechanisms within React are taking over some of the things we historically had to do ourselves as React Router. So there is an architectural shift under the hood in terms of your sort of might be swapping out one Vite plugin for but in terms of the way your app is built, it's up to each route to decide, is it going to maintain the traditional client-first route structure, which means it's backwards compatible, which is nice. Or you can say, for this route, I want to have a server component export. Or you can even have a sort of a hybrid approach, which is that your loaders and actions can just return React elements from them as well, which is effectively that was also probably the aha moment for me with server components, was realizing ultimately it's just a way to send React elements over the network as data. It's like the server has done its rendering, it's created some elements, and I'm going to send them over the network, and the browser doesn't have to do any work. It's just got these things already.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the loader and action support, because I think that is an interesting thing. And I think, it is like it's revealing as a developer using this kind of gets into this headspace. How does this actually manifest? If I'm looking like at a React component, or like how am I instrumenting that to have it be sendable like as data over the wire like this versus how I would traditionally have a component that I just import and use?
If you render a component on the server, you can do it in your loader, basically. So your loader, up until this point, your loader might have just returned like a JavaScript object with some basic properties and like basic primitive values on its strings and numbers and arrays and whatever. And now it's like you can just render a React element as part of that data structure as well.
Are there good components which are typically candidates for this? Like, when do you see something you're like, oh, I should wire this up to be loadable in this mode versus traditionally?
I think either, like I was talking about before, with components that are really heavy computationally, but ultimately just render plain elements, markdown, syntax highlighting, things like that are really good candidates. The other one is when you've got parts of your app that are just static and they just sit there. Like maybe you've got a footer on a website with a lot of links in it and so on. And do I really need to send down all this JavaScript code for how to render that when I could just send the markup down basically as React elements?
Are there any potential pitfalls here that devs can fall into in trying to get into this mode? Do you think that'll be better or worse, like with data mode versus framework mode? How are you thinking about that?
I think the biggest pitfall with server components is that because you can now do your data fetching in the component itself, it's very easy to start doing like way too many database queries or API calls separately. If you render 100 different components, all of which need to hit an API, it might not be obvious to you as you're building your application how bad that problem is getting, because you're just looking at it as, I'm just running a bunch of components and I'm going to make my code clean, I'm going to split it up and I'm going to isolate everything to these components. Whereas with the loader pattern, one thing I really like about it architecturally is it does force you to think about, I need to hoist all of the data requirements for this route up to the top. And there's a single place where I can see everything that's being done. And if I'm going to batch something, it's like, that's my place to do it. But yeah, so server components can make it really hard to be aware of how much you're hitting these APIs or making database calls too much. And that's why in our RSC data mode demo that we shipped, we did show a really great example there of how you can batch API calls or database queries, even across, as if you're rendering lots and lots of different components, there's still a mechanism there that you can use. It's all in userland though, which is really nice. Like it's using our new middleware API to provide these batch load functions to all of the different components. But ultimately, it's just using standard Node APIs for managing like scoping of those things to each request.
Let's talk about the middleware a little bit more abstractly first. Like, what is that middleware API? What can it do? What's it in charge of? What's the abstraction do?
Yeah, middleware is something that people were asking for a long time. And like a really good example of where you really feel the need for middleware is something like authentication. You don't want to have to authenticate at every single loader. You want to have an architecture where it's more like upfront, we check you at the door, we figure out everything we need at that point, and then the loaders run and they all are able to have access to any data that middleware set up as well. And that's what we're using for the batching mechanism in our demo, where basically what we're doing is we're saying, because the middleware has access to that scope of the request, it's like we know we call the middleware before we've run any of the loaders and done any rendering. And then that you can also hook into the end of that and know, okay, we've finished rendering and we're done. So you're picking it up on the way out as well. And because you have that touch point in the code for before we've done anything and after we've done everything in terms of loading and rendering, that allows us to scope any batching functions that you have, any batch like load functions to the entirety of that request.
Gotcha. So is the middleware pipeline executed once per request? Is that essentially how it goes? Gotcha. Cool. I want to delineate between what the data batching use case is versus what middleware can do, like more abstractly. Authentication in that world is still in my head like a data fetching like problem. Like there's like a, who is this person? How do I determine who they are? Are those the kinds of problems that middleware has really been leveraged to solve?
It's really trying to solve anything that people would naturally be duplicating in all of their loaders and instead want to just handle it up top for the entirety of the request.
Yeah. And you mentioned that this like data batching thing is more in userland. Do you not view middleware as userland? Is that something that you guys don't want to have devs worrying about that much and you think should be handled by kind of like the framework or the tool chain somewhere else for the most part?
It's definitely our philosophy that we want to try and keep the API as small as possible and don't add too many things that if they can be done relatively easily in userland. And I do think this example of setting up special data loading functions that are batched for the request, that's a really good example of where we could go that extra mile and start to bake that into the framework, but that just balloons up the surface area of our API just to save you a tiny bit of boilerplate. Whereas I actually do like it this other way, where it's quite clear how much of this is framework knowledge that you have to have versus you can really hook up any sort of library you want at this point when you're not bound to whatever we decide is the best pattern.
Yeah, I guess from at a higher level, then how has this kind of React 19 overall shifted your thinking about what React routers responsibilities are? Like how has that kind of the landscape changed wherein this is definitely React router's job versus React's or the framework's job?
Yeah, I mean, most of my work on React Router has been around the bundling side of things. That's definitely the perspective I'm looking at it from. That's not all that React 19 is doing, obviously, but I think what it does for us is it allows us to think more about targeting server components and like those APIs rather than having to invent a whole bunch of custom things. Why that's important to me is it means that it's much more feasible for us to support other bundlers. Our framework mode is only on Vite, and theoretically we could support other bundlers, but it's just a ton of work, especially when you think about all of the edge cases and things we have to handle. It's hard enough just supporting one bundler, basically. But I think RSC actually changes that relationship a bit for me, because like our RSC data mode demo that we showed people was actually built on top of Parcel. Parcel was the first time for me that I'd seen like an RSC API at the bundler level that really clicked and made it clear like you could build a library on top of these APIs. So it feels closer to what React Router felt like previously as a library, where I've set up my bundler and now I'm pulling in React Router and I'm just calling React Router functions in my app. The difference is that my app has an RSC environment as well as an SSR and client environment. But the bundler is managing that for me.
I keep kind of asking these questions that are more like in developers' relationship with these tools, but I'm curious about this because I feel like this is all kind of changing. Like the optics are weird. The understanding of this is just being a pluggable piece. Is that clicking with developers? Are people perceptive to that? Or is it something that like people are just so used to not even thinking about anymore that you guys are really having to be like, no, this is the goal here. Like, this is our vision.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for the better, the average developer isn't as aware of this stuff and doesn't need to be. That's why things like more the framework style solutions have become more and more popular, is because you don't have to think about these things. I just grab this thing off the shelf and it's already solved the hardest problems for me. I can just build my app. So yeah, I think this is probably more for the kind of person who would listen to this, right? Like enthusiasts who are interested in what's going on under the hood maybe a bit more as well. I think if you're making decisions about how to build your application today and what the future might be for the tech choices that you're making, the way I think about this is it means that it's making React Router more of a safe bet, I think, because it's now you're not as coupled to a particular bundler. And as we've seen with the big shift that happened from Webpack to Vite as being the default choice in the React space, if you're choosing your own bundler, this puts us in a much better spot to be able to move to something else if the community was to ever shift again. It also means that you feel more confident that if the framework mode solutions aren't working for you, for whatever reason, you can drop down a layer to the RSC data mode, and that is not coupled to any particular bundler. If you're using something else, you can just go straight to the RSC data mode and wire that up yourself.
I feel like we're painting this picture where a dev in an environment where they are choosing their own bundler feels like almost more an important delineation than are you a dev who's all in on a particular framework. The two theoretical users that we keep standing up are those two people. So with React Router having the capacity to be used as a library, again, it's bundler agnostic. Does it change your long-term vision for the project? Are you thinking about that differently at all? Like how you fit in, how you interact with the other devs working on different layers of this web app ecosystem?
I think it definitely changes where features might need to be implemented, because previously it was like if any feature relied on the bundler in any way, it had to be in framework mode and that was it. Whereas now it's, okay, is this more of just something that could work at runtime with RSC and it doesn't need any special bundler integrations beyond that? then that can live in RSC data mode. And so that means that we're much more incentivized to say, okay, let's not try to add too many of our own custom framework isms on top if we can avoid it. If we can implement it at the lower level where it feels more like a library, let's do that. And so that's, I think, making the library a lot better in the future, the more we can do that.
Do you think a lot of this has been just enabled by there being a performance necessity, like there being a functional reason to have another like runtime that exists on the server essentially? So it's like before it was always like we have these things we build and then we spit that out, but like again we were building a lot of that functionality into the bundler. But now it's like we've determined that there are performance gains if we actually have another place where code can execute. And like the devs are thinking about it. So then it seems like a lot of the functionality we've determined that, okay, we can do this in this like React server component layer. Just there is another place where we are doing logic that we are cognizant of. The end user developer is thinking about it. Do you think that was the key that unlocked that? Or was there another mindset shift that you think really drove the capacity to have React Router just able to be leveraged in this way?
I think for me, like what I've found when using the new RSC stuff that we're working on, it's actually not too different conceptually from where we've been before. Like you're talking about there's an extra environment, but I think in practice, it's almost like I'm thinking about server and client when it comes to things like data fetching and rendering server components. So there is still that separation of server and client, but I feel like that SSR environment in the middle is much less important now. Like I'm not really thinking about that one as much because it's almost more that's just a pre-rendering layer in the middle. It's just an optimization almost to say, let's take the fully resolved like React tree, including client components, and let's just spit out HTML for that. And that's its only job. In terms of thinking about server versus client, I feel like I'm still roughly only doing about this. I'm still thinking about it roughly the same way. And to that point, I think like in terms of my own journey towards becoming more interested in server components, one thing that really helped me get on board was seeing that like the bundler could spit it out as a single build artifact, single server. Because I think when I first looked at RSC, I mistakenly thought, because you talk about the SSR server and the RSC server, I thought it meant I have my actual infrastructure has to be different at runtime, but that's not the case. You know, what I really loved playing around with our first experiences playing around with Parcel was it ultimately still just spits out a single node server. And so that was like, oh, I can literally just ship the way I was shipping the day before if I was using it more standard SSR setup. Except now I get all the benefits of RSC. And it's if that's the way it's shaking out, where I don't even have to really change how I'm deploying my app or anything like that, it's like, why not start leveraging these features if it's really that simple?
The ecosystem journey is maybe like the term I would use, like how we've wound up in this world where we can have like explicit data fetching and stuff as this kind of first class citizen, but then everyone realizing maybe we don't actually need to think about it that much as long as we're like cognizant of it happening. We put some boundaries on things and then everything will just click. It's been an interesting journey over the past few years, kind of seeing this all come together. Do you think that this is really going to catch on? You mentioned before that you're hopeful that this will be the default mode in the future, that membrane will become so thin that it's not really a thing that has to be thought about much. Are you optimistic? Are you seeing that happen already? Or are you just predicting it will happen in the future?
I think we're on a natural journey towards RSC just being the natural way that framework level React tooling works. And I can see a future state where with React Router, there is no, do I choose RSC or don't I? It's more because, like I said, if the build output is still the same as it was before, and also I didn't even touch on the fact that RSCs don't, the naming's a little confusing in the sense that you don't have to have a server with React Server Components because you can generate these RSC payloads at build time and just put them on disk. Yeah. And then you can just have a static site that's just serving up RSC payloads, which is mind bending. That's again, it's another thing that's made me like, once you start to realize these things about RSC, that it's okay, my build output doesn't need to change. I don't even have to run a server if I don't want to. I think the arguments against using it start to get smaller and smaller. For me, the big concern early on was just whether there's going to be good enough support for it, because it felt, obviously, you were getting first class support in Next.js, the framework, but then it's if you're doing your own thing in a different bundler, it felt like people were still just experimenting with it rather than shipping real polished solutions. But it's been a while now since I had those concerns. And I think that the tide's definitely starting to turn. And we're building on top of the official RSC Vite plugin that's being worked on right now. It's not just some experiment at that level. It's like we're building on top of what is supposed to be the RSC solution for Vite. So it's a very different place that we're in now there as well.
We could go down a whole nother rabbit hole on if one is writing a static site with RSC, like the concept of what the bundler is doing and like that build time delineation versus runtime delineation, it starts to get very mind bendy very quickly. Maybe we could just use RSC for everything at the top level. And then do I even need to think about a bundler in the traditional sense anymore? But anyway, that's probably an episode for another. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on quick, Mark, that we didn't have time to delve into it all?
I think the big thing I want to stress is if you're listening to this, you've come this far and you're interested, definitely do jump in and start playing around with these releases that we're shipping, because I think the difference between this being the fun new thing versus what we've talked about where it becomes the new default, it's really just going to take usage to get there. So the more eyes we have on it, the better. And I'd love to hear what you think about it. And also, of course, big shout out to the team, the rest of the team for working on this as well, because obviously not just me. Jacob in particular on our team, he's the one who really pioneered this work. And he's the one who really blew my mind in terms of how you could get React Router as it exists today as a framework to run on top of RSC. It just completely broke my brain. And since then, I've been really enjoying taking his work and trying to figure out, okay, how do we get this thing to a point where we can get it in everybody's hands? So yeah, big shout out to the team.
Thank you so much for taking some time and letting me pick your brain, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.